Okay, so I'm Johnny Quach. I'm the Chief Product Officer at a company called AirHelp. We are the biggest flight delay compensation company globally. And what we do is, if your flight is delayed, airlines are supposed to pay you money for that time that you lost. What we do is we get that money, and that's pretty much it. So from a business side, you can imagine our company to be split into two major parts. One is what we call intake, which is getting customers, and the other side is called capacity, which is our ability to process all the customers we get. So inside of our company, there's a heavy focus on automation and AI and just improving and decreasing our unit economics to make it more attractive to process each claim. So that's one of our roadmaps to scale.
Yeah, and you're based in Europe.
In Europe, we have one office in Berlin, one office in Gdansk, Poland, one office in Krakow. Today, we're about 790 people. And I manage the product team, which is about 60 or so people. That includes product managers, data scientists, product analysts, localization designers, and growth.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. How do you go about managing all of them?
I think, one of the things I always kind of mention, I think in all my talks is that typically I don't really hire product managers. I typically hire entrepreneurs with product skills. And so within the AirHelp kind of like world, we give a lot of freedom to our individuals. However, we expect really, really high level of responsibility. So I think when you're thinking about these kind of people to hire, typically when you have even 60 or 100, 200 types of these guys, what you end up having is a fully autonomous and very like independently thinking team, right? So the actual day-to-day management doesn't have to be so heavy. Mm-hmm. And in reality, what you want to give is you want to give them a lot of freedom actually to be creative. The only part that gets tricky when you scale a team this size is that because everyone is so independently thinking all the time, there is a lot of overlap. There is a lot of random things that kind of like bump into each other. That's normal. And I think as long as you have a forum for dealing with those conflicts, typically you don't have to be so day-to-day managing people so specifically.
Yeah, so I presume you're looking at, from a sort of vision, because at some point you still need to help them going into the right direction.
Yeah, so like, if you take a look at many tech companies, you'll hear that they'll have, let's say, 6 or 10 product managers, and then you'll ask, what are those product managers doing? Most tech companies would tell you, this guy owns mobile, this guy owns the website, this guy owns this part, and then they break these guys down into these products, right? And AirHelp does this on some level, but I would say the major thing that we manage and we organize our people around is actually not products, it's actually metrics. So, and so what it is each of these product managers and each of these engineering teams, they're given 1 to 3 metrics to really, really focus on for like the whole fiscal year. And so, yes, you are the person that generally manages the website or the dashboard or the funnel or whatever. However, I don't really care about that. I care about the results of the metric that you own in that area. And so if there's a team that owns a metric, and this metric, let's say, is reducing drop-off. However, you can reduce drop-off in all parts of the customer experience. So this team then has the freedom to go around the rest of AirHelp and find ways to reduce that one metric, right? So it's giving people a clear sense of responsibility, but not from a product point of view, but from a results point of view.
Yeah, I like that, but there is some question in my mind regarding, for example, how do you ensure that, let's say, they don't do anything regarding branding that could be damaging, for example?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say branding and messaging are 2 of those things that have a overlapping encompassing that like it runs over a lot of things, right? Because you want the story to be very consistent within your entire touch points, all the touch points you have. And so, of course, we have those traditional teams. We have branding team, we have a PR team, we have a messaging team, we have a copywriting team. And so when it comes to certain things like that, we do have a shared service, right? So for example, I wanted copy written for this dashboard, or I wanted copy written for this email. It's actually the same team in AirHelp that does all the copywriting. So that kind of definitely helps keep it more consistent. However, most of the time, those things are actually pretty smooth for the most part. We don't have so much conflict there. Most of the time, it's actually on the technology level where teams are wanting to deploy this code to this part, but this team's conflicting, you know?
That was my
And
next
that's,
question, actually.
yeah.
So maybe we can touch a little bit on
Yeah.
that.
So I think like when that problem happens, and if I were to like make some random guess, I think it happens like probably once every 2 months. This conflict happens. And like I said earlier, it's not so much about trying to prevent it all the time. It's more about just creating a form for us to solve it when it happens. And so typically it's not so complicated. It's more about just calibrating between the two product managers or between the two teams. And one interesting fact is a company that's notoriously famous for giving product people lots of autonomy is Spotify, right? And they're maybe one of the more popular companies that invented this idea of autonomous teams that are very independent. But if you speak to any like senior engineering leader at Spotify, what they'll tell you is 30% of the engineering budget is dedicated to infrastructure, which is very surprising considering that most of their teams are running experiments, doing growth, and doing all this kind of stuff. But however, they invest a significant amount of time to create technological like infrastructure that allows the team to have freedom. And so this prevents things from breaking. This prevents from this overlapping or double deploying the same code base, right? So I would say we more or less go in this direction, but we do see that companies like that, it's a heavy focus, and you can see through their investments like this is what they believe as the way they want to run their company.
Yeah, I'm still going to play on a topic of conflicts. Do you still have conflicts between two teams where one team thinks this needs to be done in order to, reduce the drop-off, for example, but another team needs to do something else, another experiment to, have better engagement, and they realize that one is actually affecting the metrics of the other team. So, if they deploy that, then one team is getting better metrics, but the other one, is getting a worse metrics. How do you play around with that?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And so, like, there's a few things inside of AirHelp that make this conversation a lot easier. The first thing is, like I mentioned earlier, we're very results driven, which then as a side effect makes you very data driven, right? And I think most of the time I think the highest level metrics in AirHelp, they don't often overrun each other. Like if drop off goes down, it doesn't typically mean like something else gets worse, at least not the key ones we care about. There are some smaller metrics in the case that might happen, but at the main ones we care about, that's like very rare actually. Now, if the scenario is two teams don't agree on like the impact of something, so typically in AirHelp, whenever we want to do something like a fairly major release or a feature or even a new product or a new service or anything like that, typically we go for a pretty strenuous process where we produce a business case. And I think other companies have different traditions, like Amazon, I think they do this PR release. So what we do is we do a business case. And a business case is pretty straightforward in the sense we document what is the expected impact. We document what is the cost. We document over a timeline of when we would get that cost back. And it's pretty easy for the most part to have a conversation over something like that, right? And one of the keys is once you produce something like this business case, typically there's a long discussion of like, how accurate is it? So then other teams will kind of critique it, will go deep. It's like, are you sure about this number? Where did you get this number? How did you do this math? And that kind of thing is very like encouraged in AirHelp. So we have this really strong culture of constantly giving feedback of this kind of type. So typically the things that make it through the ringer are more or less, the entire party of AirHelp, like more or less feels fairly confident on the expected impact. And for us, we have this very funny culture of running experiments that are very light. And so what I call this a mock test. And typically a mock test is something that looks exactly like the feature, feels like the feature, but doesn't work, right? And so when customers click it, it'll say something like, hey, we're still working on this process, or we're still working on this feature. We'll let you know when it works. And so most of the times when I see any two people in a company disagree on what something could do, it's typically because they don't have the data on it, right? And so for us, we've found a way to quickly get data on like the most obvious and common questions that come up. And so we run a lot of these very lightweight mock tests that give us answers to like real questions. And then from those answers, we can build out a very clear business case in the long run. Yeah.
Can you give us some example of mock tests that you've run in the past?
Yeah, so there's many of these. We do it really often. So a good example is a referral program. So we have always thought about, okay, should we build a referral program? Should we not? And so for AirHelp, it's a slightly complicated thing for a referral program because not everyone who has a delayed flight has an eligible flight that could get compensation. So imagine we invested in the referral program, we built all these cool features, and it would take, I don't know, 6 months to a year to really have a good referral program, right? And so the first question is, will people use it? The second question is, if people use it, how much revenue is that? And those questions are very hard to answer if you don't know how many people will use it. So in this exact example, what we did was you would go through a funnel, and at the very end of the funnel, when everything's finished, we would just invoke a pop-up that would say, hey, refer a friend for, whatever, and then get 5 euros and your friend will get 10 euros. If you're interested, click on the start button. If you're not, click on no thanks. Then you would click on the start button. Then it would show you the actual social banners that you would click. So Facebook, Twitter, whatever, email. And when you click on one of those, it would be like, thank you. However, we're still working on this feature. We'll get back to you when it's done. And that's pretty much it. Now, if you run this for 2 days for 15% or 10% of your population, you will get numbers that are statistically significant. And from those numbers, you can literally put how many users and how many months, what's the predicted revenue, and what's the win rate, and then what's the share. And then from this, you can really calculate everything you need to have like a pretty much, most of the time, foolproof business plan. And we do this in many, many, many scenarios. And it just makes everything easier. And I'm actually surprised most companies don't do things like this more often. Yeah.
Yeah, how do you come up with all those experiments in the first place?
So it's hard to say because it's really case by case, and it depends on the question we're trying to get answered, right? And so there's a lot of examples that we do. Like for an example, like there's one thing where we said, okay, well, so people, they go through our service, and at some part of their life cycle, they're going to go for this thing we call the payout funnel, which is where we give you your money. And we thought to ourselves, okay, well, let's say a customer gets 200 euros from us, and we're going to pay this person 200 euros. We're going to transfer it to his bank account. And one question is like, well, would this person be interested in a voucher, a 220 euro voucher, for example? So we would buy the 220 euro voucher at a discount. We would give it to the customer. The partner with the voucher wins because this customer will use it. The customer gets more value, and then we get a piece of the additional revenue. So the question is, before we do this, we have to go and get a bunch of partners. So how can we test this without actually doing that?
Yeah.
So what we did is we developed one light partnership with one very big brand. And then in the payouts funnel, you just have two options, right? And so if you select the voucher one, we take you to the next step. And then when you click the button, then we say, hey, we're actually working on this, but just click this button to go back and get your bank transfer. So in reality, it's not so difficult. It's just that we build the feature as real as possible from a UI point of view, but not from a technology functionality point of view. And for the most part, that gives us all the things we need in terms of questions and answers. Yeah.
So just to circle back, the actual team that you put in place actually do come up with those experiments themselves, or is there some top hierarchy that just say like, hey, we're thinking of building, a partnership with those companies to do some, maybe some vouchers because it makes sense from a business standpoint to make more money that way. Where does this idea come from? From the bottom, from the top, from everywhere?
So generally speaking, from the top, all we communicate is metrics, and all we communicate is results. And the team has freedom on how to achieve these results, right? And so like an example of a result we expect is revenue. How you get more revenue is really up to you, right? And the teams that run these experiments, this is every team. So every team has the ability and has the creativity to come up with these ideas. And it's really funny, the example you brought up, like, hey, we think this is a big opportunity. We have this cool partner. So typically we don't do it that way. We do it backwards. Typically we imagine we have a partner, or we imagine we have this feature. And then we go, okay, well, how do we know people would use it? And if we can validate it through these tests, through data, through user research, and all those things combined, then we go out and we actually start the sales process of collecting a partner, adding other vendors and things like that. So we always try to start internally to really, really validate ideas way before we start committing any time or effort or resources. Yeah.
Yeah, so it could be that in this case, the actual test shows that having a partnership will work, but then going forward, it's not possible to find a partner because the model doesn't work for XYZ reason. Then that would be a perfectly, valid path for that idea in your company. That's correct?
Yes. So typically when we run a test, we maybe run a few more versions where we try to understand, well, what is the percentages that is interesting, right? So for example, we showed a voucher with 10% more value.
Yeah.
So then what, maybe 10% of users check that, click that instead of clicking the actual bank transfer. However, what if we showed one with like 50 euros more? Then we get 60%. And so from those percentages, I can take that and model out some financial model. And then I go, okay, we need a partner that fits in this range that has the same kind of reach as the similar brands we're testing. And then from there, what we know is we know the parameters in which this business case works. So now the job is to go and find a partner that fits within that range. So we, like I said, we always kind of go backwards. We always try to figure out what is the parameters we want to work around. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. And you probably have some hierarchy of metrics as well. So if two metrics are conflicting, you choose the one that has the highest priority?
We choose the one that has the highest revenue potential. Okay. And then depending on what our current strategy is, depends on the timeline, right? So we've invested in things and products and features that will give return over 2 years. Like we wouldn't see $1 from that for 2 years, but we've also invested in that. However, sometimes we want to invest in things that give us revenue in 90 days. So it just kind of depends on what our current focus is. And that depends on a number of factors.
Yeah, and Jenny, you mentioned at some point that the metrics were for the fiscal year. Do you actually always do the metrics for the team? I'm saying, do you always have like a yearly set of metrics, or you actually review it on a quarterly basis, or how does that actually work? This establishment of these are the metrics that we want to push this year for this time frame, basically.
Yeah, so I think we're pretty similar to most modern tech companies these days, right? So we use OKRs like most companies. Yeah. We have some company level ones, and those are limited to less than 8, right? And every department has their own, and then every team and within those departments, roll up into that. And so we have quarterly check-ins with OKRs, but personally on my one-on-ones, I go over the OKRs every week. And so of course there are times in every year where you're just like, okay, well, we need to work on this thing, but it's not in the OKR. I think a good example is GDPR, right? It's not like anybody thought, oh, wow, I'm going to make an OKR at the beginning of the year and be like, I can't wait to work on this thing. It's just not the case, right?
That's not
but those things come up like all the time, Yeah. And so for us, it's more about having the right kind of process to go, okay, if we're going to focus on that, then we can't focus on this. And we don't really ever change our OKRs. We just kind of make a note that this OKR is delayed because of this. So it's not so much like, okay, well, I can't work on it because it's not on my OKRs. Like, sorry. Yeah. That's not the kind of culture we have in the company, right? Our culture is fairly helpful for the most part. And our entire goal is very similar to what Netflix always says, which is we want to be fast, we want to be big, and we want to be flexible. And so this is a big part of us, is that we embrace this chaos and we embrace this last minute stuff and we embrace all these things that come up. And so for us, it's all about just staying focused at a high level as much as possible so that when we're executing in these details, we can pretty much take on most things because we're actually very flexible in our schedules. Yeah.
Hey, do you mind briefly just explaining for people who don't know what that is, the OKR?
Yeah, so for us, OKRs is objective and key results. And I give an example. For this year, we had an OKR called execute the summer of justice, right? And so that means we want to reach some crazy number. And that number is, let's say, 1 million customers in the summer, right? And then within that, well, what does it take for 1 million customers to exist in AirHelp? So then we come up with something called key results. And those are, let's say, more tangible statements, right? It'll be like, okay, an app rating of 4.9, 40% month over month growth over 4 months, something like that. So we come up with these things that are much more measurable, that back up this kind of high level statement. And so that's one example of an OKR. And then we have about max, I would say 10 per department. And for per product team, like 3 to 4 at most. And some other related things, which is like, we want to be the best employer in Europe. So one of the OKRs is have churn be under 15% annually. So that's another OKR. So you have some objective high-level statements, and then you have some measurable statement that you can track progress against. Yeah. And we typically try to avoid binary OKRs, like yes, it was live, or yes, it was not built. So yeah.
Oh yeah, I got it. So okay, so I know what OKR is. One of the difficulty in OKR is to not link that to performance review. So now I'm going to come back into people management. How do you actually combine the OKR with effectively the performance review of the individuals?
Yeah, so for us, this is also a problem that we've kind of struggled with, right? Yes, there are very, I think, good reasons for it not to be tied to performance reviews. But at the same time, you do need some way to tie goals with performance, right? Yeah. And that's the problem. So for us, we haven't found a very smart way to solve that. So our OKRs are tied to performance as of right now. But so how we do this is a bit more fun. So I think traditionally, if you have an OKR that says get 100,000 customers, if you reach 60% of it, that's considered a win, right? So what we do is slightly different. So we have 10 OKRs, and what we expect is half of those to be hit at 100%. So it's kind of a slightly different way. So what we want to do is have 10 really ambitious OKRs, knowing that half of them won't make it. But the ones that do make it reach 100% potential. And for the most part, performance reviews are around that expectation. Hitting 50% is fantastic. Yeah.
Got it. So basically, if I boil that down at the top, there is a sort of like, we got these 10 goals we want to hit. You don't really know which one you're going to hit, but you can expect 50% of those goals will be hit.
Exactly. So that's why the 10
cool.
And that's why the 10 you pick better be very good.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
So you have to go, okay, if we missed a random 5, would that destroy the company?
There you go.
Yeah. Obviously you don't want that. Okay. And the funny thing is, yes, goals and OKRs are tied to performance, but company OKRs also tied to performance. Department OKRs tied to performance of the whole department. Individual OKRs tied to the individual. So your performance and your kind of like reward at the end of the year is based on all 3 things working and all 3 things hitting 50%, right? And for the most part, that gives you a sense of ownership. So if you're working on a feature that's gonna help you accomplish one OKR, however, you're having another teammate who's saying, hey, I need help with this. And if you help them with that, it'll accompany one of the company ones. You also benefit from an individual. And this I really like. So this enforces that departments within the company need to support each other, right? So all departments try to help each other receive their goals, because that in turn helps achieve company goals. And I think this kind of thing where you get some benefit when the company does well is super key. So you get benefits from all levels, so you don't become siloed into just what your product or your features or your own goals. Yeah.
No, I think that's very important because, otherwise each team will look at their own sort of metrics and don't really have time for the other ones. GDPR is a good example that we're going to keep on using, because the GDPR is something that affects everyone. And this may not have been something that made it to the OKR when the OKR were built at the beginning. So there may be some disruptive element mid-year, for example, that comes in and it's like, hey guys, we actually need to hit this before that timeline. How do you guys adapt to those changes that are big, important, and mandatory changes?
Yeah. So obviously, I think the question is better asked like, what do you do when you're told you have to do it by the landscape, right? Yeah. So like we don't have a discussion of we should or should not. In these cases, we have to do it. Like right. In any kind of cases where there's like some law and we just have to do it, we have to do it. So the question is, how do you judge the performance of your team when you're asking them to take away 2 months of their whole year to work on this, for example?
There you go. Yeah, hijacking resources, but also coordinating at the whole level, because GDPR is something that actually impacted multiple different layers. And it wasn't easy to actually figure out what is the exact real impact that's going to be within the company. So,
yeah. So the first thing we do is when we hear about something this starting to happen, what we want to do is we want to understand the impact on our business.
Yep.
So in this case, I go back to my earlier example of running tons of mock tests. So we show the checkbox here, we show the checkbox there, we see what the impact is. We go, okay, so of all these three, this one performs the worst, which is good, in the sense that the worst in the sense that it doesn't do anything bad to our business. But then we go, okay, so then does that exist within the realms of the requirements for releasing this? Like, does this check all the GDPR boxes? Yeah. Okay, yes, it does. So now we have a solution that has no impact to the actual core business. Okay, so now execution. So I think for us, like specifically with GDPR, and there's been other examples of things like this, the team that we put on it, in their OKRs, we just make sure to document that this happened. So at the end of the year, when we're having this conversation of like, oh my God, why did you miss 70% of your goals? It's very easy for me and you to be like, oh, okay, clearly, a whole quarter went to this. So then from there, it's just like doing some kind of common sense discussion about what's like fair or not fair. But the whole point is this though, we don't want people to feel like if you have to do something to help the company survive something like that, like somehow that is personally damaging. We wanted to make it like you're rewarded for this kind of dedication, right? So I don't look at that and go, oh, well, you should have did both. It's not that, right? It's more like, wow. Yeah, it's more like a maturity thing. It's like, wow, like your team took the time, did a good job on that, put this on hold for the sake of another department or even for the sake of the company. And at the end of the day, it's just like, and it always goes back to the first thing I said, which is you want to hire entrepreneurs because entrepreneurs think everything they're responsible for. And when you have that sense of like ownership, these kind of things don't become discussions. Like people execute because they understand it's important for the whole company. And this is kind of attitude you really, really need in your team.
All right, I love it. Let's move into this field then, because I got a few questions about that. It's all fine, hiring entrepreneurs and stuff, but what if, for example, an entrepreneur actually doesn't reach his goal because not because of the lack of ownership, but more because he would have need some part of training. Do you have anything to actually support that, or how do you actually handle that personal goals?
Yes. Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So we're starting to invest much more heavily into this. So we're looking into a ton of things. And it's a little early for us. So we have, of course, workshops. We have trainings that anyone in the company can sign up for. I mean, we're at a scale of headcount, like 790 to 800 people that we can actually have ongoing, you can say, academies within the company, right? So, of course, we offer internal workshops like conflict management, stress management, prioritization skills, things like that. But I would say this, and this is a very weird statement, and it might just be
we can cut it off if you're not happy about it.
It's weird in the sense that I think most of my team learns from me through osmosis, right? So like my direct reports, my managers, my line managers that manage the rest of the team, these guys I spend the most time picking, and these guys I spend the most time with.
Sure.
And so those technical skills that are needed kind of just like, they just kind of float through the whole company, right? And I think the weird thing is people think that the way you look at a problem has to be trained. And for us, it's just showing people how, like, I myself would look at a problem. And from there, people kind of get, like, generally the high level point of how I would think through something, right? And it's just doing that critique over and over and over. And the funny thing is, if you show me a UI and I give you feedback on it, you might learn some things. However, if you put together a business case and I give you feedback on that, from that one feedback session, the expectations of the company become very clear. Because when you're giving feedback on something as detailed as timeline for revenue, expected impact of this, how many people would it, like, you're going down line by line by line by line. When you give this kind of level of feedback on this kind of detailed thing, people typically go, okay, I understand the expectation is that I need to know all these numbers, that these numbers will be accurate, that I need to spend this much time to go for this many things. And so that's the difference between the main thing I think with our company is that we give a lot of feedback on the business case. But the actual UI, the actual feature, this is very light feedback Because like I said before, a lot of our time goes into thinking about what to work on, thinking about what the real problem is. And the actual execution is a very light part of our process. And so I like to imagine that 90% of our time we think about the problem and 10% we execute. Because executing is actually the easiest thing for us. It's really getting those details right. So when I have people think about problems at a very fundamental level, like a very basic level, money in, money out, then the expectation of how they should think of every single decision, every single opportunity, every single interaction in AirHelp, it becomes that is the basis or the Bible of how we function as a human in our company, right? And so this, however, the cool thing is this thing exists in every department. So if the customer service team wants to do something or they are requesting a feature of this, they also produce some sort of documentation like this, and we also give the same level of feedback. So when you do this as the normal way of working, everybody understands that, okay, and those skill sets that are missing, they get developed very quickly, right? So when you're going for these critiques and these feedback talks. So I think my answer in a simple way is like, we teach by having people do the thing a lot in detail. That's very hard.
Yeah, I love that. You mentioned, quickly your manager. So if you have a lot of entrepreneur, I think one of the key benefits is to have a very lightweight management style. But so what are your manager exactly doing in your company?
So my managers are more in charge of giving very specific feedback. So as I mentioned earlier, I might give feedback on business cases, but my managers will actually give feedback on the UI, on the execution, and things like that. And of course, conflicts do come up, miscalibration comes up, misalignment comes up. So my managers are focused on learning how to negotiate between departments, between teams, making things go smoothly. So that skill set of being a strong negotiator or being charismatic or having a strong level of influence, this is important in a company, because you really need to like spend enough time so people really trust your decision making. And so my managers and my direct reports have that skill set much better than more of my junior people, right? So that soft skill part of your experience comes a little later in your career. And so that's my direct reports are very good at that. And me and myself, that's usually the skill set I focus with them the most on getting better at. Not the other stuff, right? Not the technical stuff, not to how to do a better design or release a better test. It's not that. It's really focused on the actual soft skills. This is the most common feedback and common thing we discuss with my direct managers. Yeah.
Okay, I love it. Okay, so let's talk about hiring, because that's obviously a very important part of the equation.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you have your manager needs to be influential, needs to have a lot of soft skill. At the same time, the entrepreneur needs a different set of skills in order to execute and be, taking ownership about everything and so on. Can we talk a little bit about how you go about recruiting entrepreneur type of people, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So it happens very naturally now, and I think it's been very fortunate. So in the last 2 years, I've done maybe like 16 or 18 different talks at different conferences or meetups or something like this. And the theme of my talk is really focused on building a culture that focuses on growth. And this is just by like coincidence, but because I talk about this topic and I talk about the way I think about problem solving, and I talk about the way I run a team, and I talk about the kind of people I'm looking for, just from those public engagements and those public speaking events, I get tons of guys asking to come and work at AirHelp. I mean, like an insane amount. Every time I do a talk, I get like 50 LinkedIn ads next day, and I got 20 of those guys asking for like, hey, do you have coffee? Can I work for you? And so, it's just that I'm saying, if you ever work in AirHelp, this is how it's going to be. So 99% of people don't want to work in that environment where it's chaotic, where there's so much freedom, there's so much responsibility. A lot of people will say that, but in reality, it's not like the most comfortable, right? You really have to be able to handle a lot.
Yep.
So I try to be so vividly clear when I'm speaking on stage that is what it feels like to work at AirHelp. And then in the interview, I think within minutes, it's pretty obvious that I'm not going to be over your shoulder telling you what to do line by line. people instantly get that vibe, I think, when I speak to them. And in the interviews, I'm just trying to be so vivid and trying to paint such a clear picture of what it is to work at AirHelp that only the non-faint of heart would join. So you could say it's like a natural selection process in the sense that if you make it through like the first interview and second interview, you're probably a guy who's going to handle the pressure perfectly fine, right? Because I'm not telling you, oh yeah, no, everything's very easy and we just chill out and then every quarter we release one big. No, it's not like that at all. So I think it's just being super transparent about that and seeing that as a strength of your company and not a weakness, right? Like you should be okay saying this company has a lot of chaos. We have a lot of things that don't work out and we have a lot of things that overlap. We're constantly working on it, but generally speaking, the reason for chaos is our growth. The more success we have, the more things we have to deal with. And so if you're into joining a company that has high growth, which comes with a high level of chaos and a high level of dependency, then this is company for you. If you're not into that, then it's very clear that this is like a place that would make most people unhappy if you're not into that level of freedom and responsibility. So you just have to paint yeah.
No, go ahead.
I think you just want to paint that picture so vividly clear in every touch point with any potential hire, I think is the key.
So you're hiring for, culture fit, first thing.
So yes, and that's probably the only thing that I ever have to like fire people over, right? That's literally the only reason, culture fit. It's usually not like, well, this person doesn't know how to do this skill. That's rarely the problem. It's mostly culture fit. And which is why we try to spend so much time discussing it in the interview.
Do you have everything is in one place, right? You don't have any remote people, or do you?
Not really, though we do allow remote work. It's not such an issue for us. So yes, time to time, there'll be some guys that'll be in some other place for 4 weeks. But we do have 3 offices. And so people working from home is not such an issue for us because everybody's kind of distributed anyways. But we do encourage the guys to be traveling within the offices pretty often. So most of my managers will travel between offices once every month and a half or so. And I'm within all 3 offices every single month. So we encourage a lot of cross-office kind of traveling. But yeah, we don't have so many remote people anymore.
Why is that? I mean, there's nothing wrong about it, but why did you decide to be co-located instead of effectively, just adding even more chaos and having, people just working from everywhere in the world?
So I don't think we're actually even against it. It just doesn't come up. And I think not the weird thing, but it's just very common that most people prefer to be inside of an office. And I think it's actually, there's lots of these people who would love to work alone. I'm probably not one of them. I don't like working from home. It's super boring. I get sleepy, it's lonely. I have no one to eat lunch with, there's all these problems. So I like being in the office. And for some reason, the people that we find to join AirHelp also like being in the office. Not to say that we don't have a fairly liberal amount of people that work from home every Friday, every few Thursdays, or whatever. It's fine. We're not tracking this kind of stuff. So I think the default is everyone really likes to be inhabiting, as you say. But we give quite a lot of freedom for people to define their own schedules and to work from home, or if they're sick or they need to go pick up mail. I don't ask so many questions, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't actually make it difficult to make sure that everyone is in one place for, company meetings or ad hoc announcements or stuff like that.
Yeah, and I often think about this problem of finding the right channels to communicate at a very wide level in a company. Like you have a lot of people and you got to find a way to distill information to everyone. And I think we haven't figured out perfectly, right? But what I've come to a realization is it's just one of those problems you don't fix, you just improve over time. And so we do it for a lot of things. Of course, we're using Slack. We use a lot of employee appreciation products. We use something called Bonusly, where you can send people bonus points for doing something great. So you can tag each other. It's super nice. And if you get enough points, you get a day off. You get enough points, you can buy a Spotify account. And, you can redeem.
But a day off doesn't mean anything because at the end you're judged on your OKR, so...
Yes, but at the end of the year, we also do a performance review, but also your performance involves how well you work with other people. So
Okay.
we also get 360 feedback on each individual, right? Because as most product managers, you're just interfacing with so many different people in a different day. Your ability to make everyone feel confident in you is a very important one. So we definitely check that.
Interesting. Yeah.
But it's just that when we encourage these employee recognition platforms, it just creates more activity and conversation within the team, so that when we announce something, that information gets spread within those individuals independently as well. Because if you imagine a company that has no way for people to really communicate except for just the bare minimum Slack chat, you won't have people having those serendipitous conversations over
That's
time,
right.
right? And that's what you're trying to create. You're trying to create lots of personal connections all throughout the company. It doesn't matter how many people, so that when you tell one person one thing, that information kind of spreads in a good way, right? And so obviously you have to be careful with confidential things, but when you're really making an announcement, that news spreads fast because everyone is talking and chatting over lunch all the time. And this is kind of, I think, one high level way of improving communication for a company, just to create more interchanging communications, and don't focus so much on producing the perfect high level communication. It's really encouraging people to share information across the company. Yeah. And it's actually, like, I guess it's very surprising because I'd make a statement to one person, and within 2 minutes, a fourth person would message me about it.
Comes
I'm like,
back.
okay, well, I guess it's working. And then you're like, okay, great. I'd tell someone, oh, I had steak for lunch, and then the third guy's like, hey, I like steak too. It's like
Interesting.
information travel. I think information travels. I think maybe too fast in AirHelp. We have a different problem, I think. Yeah.
That's a funny one. So let's come back a little bit about hiring at this stage. Let's start with, when do you know it's time for hiring more people?
I think this heavily relies on company strategy, right? And I always like to think about everything. The basis is our strategy. And so it depends. So some years we say, okay, this year we're trying to improve the quality of our service as a theme for the company. So in this case, maybe I wouldn't hire more people. In this case, maybe I would hire people more focused on creating a more universal experience or things like that. So you don't need to hire more people in this case, maybe, right? Unless you're missing some very specific skill sets. However, if then the goal is like, okay, we need to grow 80% next year. Okay, then I need to think about, okay, well, what are the metrics that need to move that would get us to 80%? Okay, so we do this exercise. Okay, well, so this drop off has to drop by half. This conversion rate has to go up by 20%. And this claimant ticket, blah, 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 blah. And then when I come up with those numbers, then I go, okay, well, what is achievable within the opportunities I know that exist, right? So let's say we have a drop off of, let's say, 10%. And I'm saying we need to get to 5% to roll up to this 80% growth next year. Okay, so of the 10%, can I reduce it by 5%? Like, what is it that I need to do? And so I think of the high level problems off the top of my head. You generally have an idea of these things. And then you go, okay, how much effort is it to solve all those problems? And can one team do it? And then from there, it's pretty easy to go, okay, no, we need another team to dedicate to this part, another team to dedicate to this part. So for me, the process just starts with understanding the amount of impact you want to have at the high level metrics, and then digging a little deeper, going, well, what actually has to happen? What actually needs to be built? What actually has to be improved? And then from there, putting teams into place that take apart each of those small parts of the problem. So that's how I know, okay, we need more teams or less teams. Yeah.
And how big are your teams, roughly?
Typically one product manager and somewhere between 2 to 5 engineers and a data analyst, and depending on the team, sometimes a designer. So it's about 6, 7, 8 people at max. Yeah. We have some teams that are in the 10 people range, but typically it's around 6 to 7, I think.
Okay, so I guess the chaos come from having a lot of small teams instead of like one big team.
I think the chaos that comes, definitely having small teams with different projects going on is a cause of chaos, of course. But those teams kind of organically learn to communicate with each other very frequently. So the chaos is just when I say something to you, you say something to him, he says something to her, and then it's like a different sentence. So that
Sure.
happens. And it's more about just knowing that happens and not freaking out over it, and instead just like, okay, well, that was wrong, let's change it, right? So the chaos happens, yes, with the little teams, but it also happens if you have one big team, if they're not aligned in the vision and the strategy.
For sure.
So for us, the misalignment always comes from strategy. If the strategy we communicate isn't clear or gets changed or people interpret it differently, this is where all the problems kind of stem from. So I think starting at a company level, at a CEO level, really having a crisp and clear and easy to understand strategy, then it becomes very clear for everyone to instill that and then really take it into their teams, I think.
Got it. So does that mean that some of those teams actually are located, can actually shift locations or not in order to adapt to the changing nature of the communication or the landscape or the different goals and so on? Do they actually move, or are they, just having their own place?
They move a lot. So I would say a team would focus on 1 or 2 metrics for 2 quarters. And then maybe on the 3rd quarter, like they're focusing on something completely different. That happens a lot. And that happens because we learn things for the year. Sometimes we go, oh, well, this metric is not really it's not really having the impact on the higher level metric that we thought.
Interesting.
So we had incorrect assumptions. Okay, so what is the right thing? And or sometimes, and this really happens a lot, it's kind of like, oh my God, we discovered this huge opportunity that users that dropped off that we can actually recover now with this change in the landscape. Okay, put a squad together. We literally form a team of like 5-6 people. Okay, solve this problem for the next 6 months. And so we do that a lot. Like people are constantly shifting like what they're focusing on. Maybe not on a weekly level, but maybe on a bi-quarterly level, you do see this team shift a lot. I would say even half the teams change focus by the middle of the year. So we form a lot of these kind of hit squads, you could say, that are more thematic in their approach. So they'll be given like some high level problem that we know there's an opportunity to fix, and then they'll go and focus on that for like, a few months.
Okay, lovely. I'm gonna switch back again. When you're actually hiring those entrepreneur type of people, of course you let them know about the culture and so on, and that's one of your filter. Do you have some examples of key questions or some tips and advice for people who want to get this type of culture in their own company? How can they go about hiring those people, and how can they actually assess if they're one of those entrepreneur type person?
So the funny thing is, most of my interviews are 30 minutes max.
Okay.
And typically I only really ask 3 questions. And those 3 questions more or less tell me all the things I'm really looking for, right? So the first question is, tell me about your work experience. And I think this is a funny question because every interview will ask you this, but I'm shocked how many people are not prepared to answer this well.
Oh, really? Yeah, because it's the base question everyone has to answer. Yeah.
And everyone's ready to answer it, but not everyone's really answering it well.
Yeah, okay.
Because a lot of times the answers are like very vague, like, oh, I did this, I did that. And then from there, maybe I'll dig in one level deeper. I'll be like, okay, so maybe you can define the metric that you're talking about. Like, what was that? And often I find when I dig into the metric level, if someone can't really answer that, you can see it like a red flag immediately, right? Because if you're not focused on some metric or KPI, it's very hard for me to think you would survive in a company where we're always results driven, right? And if you can't even identify the main reason you're doing something, it's really a red flag. So that's the first question. And usually that tells a lot, maybe 80% of the problem. The second question is, I always ask people to describe the perfect job. And I often preamble this with that fact that tell me your dream job, and it doesn't have to be at AirHelp, right? It could be at Google, it could be at Apple, it could be at Amazon, it could be your own company. Like, tell me what the perfect workday looks like anytime in your life. And so what I'm listening for is not like, I'm not judging people going, okay, well, he wants to start his own company, I'm not going to hire him. He wants to work. It's not like that, right? I think the reason I ask that is because I want to know what their long-term like vision of happiness looks like. And then I go, well, can we provide some share of that happiness, of that kind of stuff that they like? Do we have that here? And so that's what I'm looking for. And so that's just me checking for them if they're going to be happy here, right? And then so the last question I ask, and people really get shocked by this. I often ask people, if you, at your current company or your previous company, if you're not working right now, if you were the CEO, what would you do in the first 90 days?
I love this one.
And I
Absolutely love this
listen,
one.
and I listen like a crazy person. I listen to every single word, right? And I often find that the people that give answers like, I would improve the user experience, this is not the guy we're looking for, because this is not the problem you think of as a CEO. That's not the problem you think of as an entrepreneur, actually. So in reality, you hear everything. It just comes out. It also comes out the fact that people are very nervous to answer. This is probably
It's
also
true.
not the right guy, right? But if person's like, oh, this is a great question, and they're just super excited, and then they go into it like, okay,
Yep.
first I would talk to everybody, I would solve this problem, I would cut this, I would hire these, then it's like, okay, it doesn't matter what they're saying. Like the context is like not that important. It's really about the way they're thinking through their process and the excitement they have when they're given so much power, right? So that's
That's
what
a
I'm
good
looking
one.
for. Like, yeah, if you're super damn excited about these kind of questions, you're the kind of guy we're looking for. It's that simple, I think. Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm taken, Johnny, but
No.
I already got my own company, but it sounds super exciting. So, well, speaking of which, if someone wants to apply at AirHelp, what should they do?
They can obviously go on airhelp.com/careers, or they can just add me on LinkedIn and send me a message. I'm on LinkedIn a lot.
There you go. Any book recommendation? Any thing that you think people should read in order to be successful?
I mean, I go for themes, and right now I'm really into reading a lot of strategy books.
Oh, good.
And
Which
before
one?
I was so for like good strategy, bad strategy, that's a
Oh
nice.
yeah, I just got it. I'm halfway
Yeah,
through.
this
It's a good
one
one.
I like for the most part. I like the
Yeah.
simplicity of those things, right now.
Applying strength to weakness. Yes, I like that.
Yeah, exactly. And because of this interest in strategy, I'm really into like books about economy.
Okay.
So recently I've been reading more books by Tyler Cohen, I believe his name is. This is really great economist that writes these beautiful books. Also has an amazing podcast. And there's a recent book I'm reading that's a little dry but pretty interesting. It's called The Strategy or the Conflict or Strategy of Conflict. And it's a game theory book about political negotiations. So for me, I think like topics that are very foreign, in which when I read about it, I'm trying to distill kind of the fundamental learnings from it
Hmm.
that I can apply to like how I think of problems. That's really what I focus on. So I don't read so many tactical books like, okay, and this is growth hacking 101. You should do this. I don't read any of that stuff. I mostly try to get better at thinking about problems the correct way. And so that usually ends up in strategy books, in philosophy books, and economy books. And those are things that just currently are my big interest. Yeah.
Really cool. Okay, well, Johnny, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. And how can people get access to you? LinkedIn?
LinkedIn, look at my name, Johnny Quach. Twitter, Johnny Quach Key, or something like that. But yeah, it's pretty easy to find me. If you type my name to Google or YouTube, I should pop up for the most part. And johnnyquach.com also exists. So yeah,
So
everything's
people
there.
can find you, yeah, if they want to.
Yeah,
Amazing.
if they want to find me, they can definitely stalk me. No problem.
All right. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Ciao.